Bookseller Crow, almost live.
Quite a thing though, isn't it, in contemporary documentaries, so they'll have the bit where they're getting ready.
Yeah.
And get blown nose and all this stuff.
It's very Alan Partridge. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to good evening. Welcome to Bookseller Crow, and our wonderful event, which I'm glad you're all here. It sold out very quickly, so lucky you for getting tickets. We are still keeping the events as sort of compact as we can, obviously due to the times we're living in. So welcome, and I'm going to do the introduction to the introduction. So I'm going to introduce Travis is here tonight. Travis Elborough, a very good friend of the bookshop, who has written many a wonderful book, and is one of our finest social historians living today.
Subsisting today. In the current economic climate, as it were.
And Chris Schüler is here. We're obviously here to celebrate his book tonight, which I think is your 6th book.
Yep.
The Wood That Built London. So please put your hands together for both wonderful authors.
And thank you, Karen. Thank you for the Bookseller Crow for hosting this marvellous event. This is Chris's book. It's called The Wood That Built London, a human history of the Great North Road. And I think that the human element is an important part of the book. What we thought we'd do was Chris is going to read a smallish section from the book. It's wood related, but it's more about Crystal Palace as becoming an entity. And so to put you in a geography you will know well, I'm hoping. There's some of you just strayed in randomly from other districts and just fancied the sound of Crystal Palace and rocked up here from the word crow in the book's title. So Chris is going to read for a little bit, and then we're going to be discussing his book and just the whole idea of the Great North Road. We're going to be, in a sense, beating the bounds of the Great North Wood, which, as Chris eloquently writes about it in the book, would be a merging between the old and the young, and would often be undertaken under the influence of alcohol. So we're kind of replicating some of that beating of the bounds activity, with less violence and drunkenness, hopefully, though you're welcome to stay around for more drink, and maybe a little more static than in those times. So, Chris.
Okay, so I'm jumping in here right in the middle of the 19th century when the wood has been in existence for millennia and is already significantly on the decline. Then the Crystal Palace came, John Ruskin recalled. After the closure of the Great Exhibition of 1851, Joseph Paxton's huge glass and iron greenhouse was dismantled and moved from Hyde Park to Penge Place, where it was reconstructed and enlarged between 1852 and 1854. The traveller passing along the Brighton Railway, noted the Observer in June 1853, would have seen enormous mounds of earthwork and bricks heaped up along the base of the hill, a vast extent of sandy-looking soil, denuded of trees or verdure, and towering above like the skeletal remains of some huge antediluvian monster, the gigantic ribs and framework of the building. The palace was opened by Queen Victoria in June 1854, and 2 water towers designed by Isambard King and Brunel were added the following year to feed the many fountains. Standing 280 feet tall, almost half the height of the present Crystal Palace transmitter, they were clearly visible across much of South London. Ruskin was characteristically disparaging, describing the structure as possessing no more sublimity than a cucumber frame between 2 chimneys, and complaining that its stupidity of hollow bulk dwarfs the hills at once, so that now one thinks of them no more but as 3 long lumps of clay on lease for building. The palace changed the area dramatically, forever spoiling the view, Ruskin continued, and bringing every show day from London a flood of pedestrians down the footpath who left it filthy with cigar ashes for the rest of the week. Then the railroads came, and expatiating roughs by every excursion train who knocked the palings about, roared at the cows, and tore down what branches of blossom they could reach. Straddling the Kent-Surrey border, the structure itself covered 18 acres and was set in 200 acres of terraced and landscape park that completely altered the topography, obliterating Old Copple Lane, Isabel Hill, the Shire Ditch and what was left of Penge Common. This presented a challenge to the parishioners of Camberwell, who still beat the bounds in the traditional way. On Ascension Day in May 1874, the vicar, constable, beadle, gorgeous in the red and gold of ancient bumbledom, and vestryman, accompanied by a number of children, doggedly followed the boundary of their parish through the stately pleasure dome, brandishing willow wands. Entering en masse through the gate from the high-level station, the company proceeded through the new dining room and thence through the intervening courts and elegant saloon, where the diners seemed somewhat astonished at their entrance. Afterwards, the parishioners retired to the Greyhound in Dulwich, where ample justice was done to a very capital repast.
Fantastic, Chris. I mean, one of the things that strikes me about the book is how important names are.
Yes.
To the whole thing and to the whole story, and also some quite fascinating names of butterflies, Leather Bottle Lane, and the areas around this area which sing of former verdure, shall we say? Collier's Wood, Honor Oak, Gypsy Hill, Norwood. Now, one of the many fascinating things that your book reveals, in a sense, is that the name Great North Wood is not that old, as a coinage anyway. And I myself have come down today from the barren north of Stoke Newington, although I did have a distant relative who's an early mayor of Croydon. So top that, folks. But anyway, but I guess, in order to be, in the interest of clarity, really, can you tell us, why is it the Northwood?
Yeah.
Where's the name come from? And obviously, from my perspective, it's quite a southerly wood.
Yes.
And even from the point of view of London, it's south of that particular district. And also, give us beat your own bounds. Explain a little about what's its terrain, when it dates from, and what is its parameters in a way.
Well, the wood was probably originally a survival of the ancient wildwood that was grubbed up in most places, sometimes as early as the Neolithic, to make way for arable farmland. But along the Norwood Ridge that rises sort of really from Brockley and runs all the way to Crystal Palace and Norwood, and then descends sharply towards the Croydon Valley. That land was too steep really to cultivate, so the trees were allowed to remain, but they were managed as a productive resource, usually by coppicing, which means cutting the tree just a few inches above the ground and then allowing it to regrow. This actually, the great woodland ecologist Oliver Rackham once remarked that a wood is no more destroyed by felling than a meadow is by cutting, because what you get is a highly developed root system that's capable of sustaining a huge tree, and often with the burden of sort of diseased and damaged branches, now got nothing to do but push up new shoots. Actually, coppicing can increase the lifespan of an individual tree by 3 times. And what happens is that a woodland is, the name coppice also refers to not just to the individual tree that has been coppiced, but also to an area of coppiced trees. And most landowners divided their coppiced woodland into sections which were cut in rotation, so that by the time they felled the first one had regrown. And this produced, usually in the space of about 10 years, a number of strong, stout, but also sort of flexible and very regular poles, which in a pre-industrial age were incredibly valuable. They were used to make chair legs, table legs, wheel axles and spokes. The thinner ones were used to make wattle, either to pen in cattle, or also used as infill in timber frame houses, which are then covered with plastered daub. So this was a major industry basically. Now these woods, in consequence of their economic value, survived really until the 19th century with the Industrial Revolution, when that woodland economy collapsed. Now the woods stretched some 7 miles really, basically from Brockley all the way to Selhurst, and they fell under different ownership. For much of the Middle Ages, all of the northern part belonged to Bermondsey Abbey. The southern part belonged to the Manor of Croydon, which since Anglo-Saxon times had been a possession of the Archbishops of Canterbury. Now that is why it was called the North Wood, because it was north of Croydon. And of course there were other woods within the manor to the south. And the Great does not, that has been widely accepted for decades, if not a century, that it's called the Great North Wood. But I could find no evidence for it prior to the late 19th century. All the historic maps and documents refer to it as Northwood or Norwood. Great seems to have been a Victorian invention. A bit like the name the River Effra. It only appeared just as the reality was fading into the past. I actually found the first mention of it in, I think, the Proceedings of the Surrey Archaeological Society of 1863, but then it's got a little small g. It was just an adjective, but obviously people picked up on that and thought it was part of the name, and it went from there.
I mean, maps are a field of fascination and interest for you anyway, and the book discusses a lot about the various mappings, and so in a way you say but there isn't really a kind of full map, and you had to kind of piece together bits of
Yes.
the woods.
Well, there are full maps, but they tend to be either maps of London and its surroundings, or county maps of Surrey and Kent, and obviously they don't show the woods at a very great scale. One of the best and most accurate that was made before a lot of the woods disappeared was made by a surveyor called Thomas Milne in the 1790s. He was the first to use really modern surveying methods, including the sort of use of the theodolite. Anyway, that's a portion. His map shows the land 10 miles around London in all directions, so that is just the relevant bit of South London, and you can see the woods here going all the way down, but unfortunately the southernmost part is beyond his 10-mile limit. That earlier map is John Rock's map of London and its environs, which is about half a century earlier. Very good for its time, but the surveying isn't sufficiently accurate to superimpose onto a modern map. It had simply he was a very good cartographer, but the technology didn't really exist at the time. The theodolite developed rapidly in the course of the 19th century, and in the course of the 18th century, and then you also get the establishment of the Ordnance Survey baseline at Hounslow, which you have to have an accurate base to start with, otherwise each successive measurement gets more and more inaccurate. But yes, where were we?
Yeah,
Maps.
sorry, yeah.
Yes.
I guess one of the things you sort of alluded to in a way is that different manners, that the ownership of the Great North Wood, and one of the things that comes across in the section about the beating of the bounds is that because they were so drunk, disputes about where the boundaries would often be.
Absolutely.
And I think probably the two key concepts, which is perhaps essential for understanding the wood in its primish life, are both what was known as forest law and also the rights of the common. Can you tell us a little bit about I mean, I think they're complicated terms in some respects because people assume they mean what they don't mean, but it might be interesting or at least illuminating if you could unpick them a bit for the audience.
I thought it necessary to sort of talk about the forest law. It did not directly apply to this wood because forest, which is a Norman French term that was introduced by William the Conqueror, refers to not to an area covered by trees necessarily. It refers to an area that is reserved as a royal hunting ground, and very strict penalties were in force for anyone who infringed that. I mean, it could be woodland. I mean, obvious examples are New Forest and Sherwood Forest, but it didn't necessarily have to be wooded. I mean, there's in Lancashire there's the Forest of Bowland, which is largely moorland and fells with not that many trees on its higher levels, whereas a wood was somewhere that was actually more accessible. It was not in direct royal ownership, although you have to remember that as of the Norman Conquest, the monarch was the ultimate owner of every square inch of land in this country. But the woods could be held. A woodland could be held freehold by a lord of a manor, or in many cases by the church. And much of this wood was held by the church, the northern part of it by the Abbey of Bermondsey and the southern part by the Archbishop of Canterbury. But then Henry VIII, of course, dissolved the monasteries, and he sold the manor of Dulwich to a London goldsmith called Thomas Courton. And then in the early 17th century, Courton's grandson, Francis Courton, found himself in financial difficulty and sold the estate to Edward Lane, who of course founded Dulwich College there. But throughout that period, from the Abbey of Bermondsey through Courton, through Elaine, the woods were managed and coppiced in much the same manner, on a rotational basis. The prohibitive forest laws, which were so hated that much of them were repealed under Magna Carta, and in fact the section of Magna Carta that dealt with them was 10 years later was hived off into a separate thing called the Charter of the Forest, a separate piece of legislation, and expanded. They didn't directly apply to these woods, but they did influence the way that landowners permitted people access. There were what are called customal rights, whereby in certain parts of the woods, local people without land of their own could graze their animals and collect firewood. In fact, the usual practice, and this was, enshrined in custom, was that growing coppices could be fenced off for 7 years to prevent animals from grubbing up and grazing the young shoots. But after 7 years they had to be opened so that people could let their pigs go in there and forage for acorns or beech moss, depending on what the tree was there. And they could also gather firewood, and there were various other rights. These were often resisted by landowners, and a source of continual dispute.
I mean, I guess post Henry VIII, where it's already starting in a way, is it's already there, really, isn't it? The reason it's such a resource for Bermondsey and also for the Archbishop of Canterbury is because, as your book says, the wood that built London, the wood has uses, has value. So, I mean, it's used in shipbuilding, it's used in construction, and also, I suppose, connecting us slightly, my last book about spectacles is it's used in glass making.
Yes.
And baking. I'll come on to one of the fantastic facts about possible baking a bit slightly later on into the 17th century, but this idea in a way that the wood has particular types of trees, doesn't it? Particularly
Yes.
of oak and hornbeam.
Yes,
Both of those
right.
are particularly useful at a point when Britain is just beginning to flex its exploratory / colonial power in a way. Maybe we could.
Yes. Well, of course they are hardwood trees. The oak obviously was, which is mostly sessile oak, which tends to grow on uplands and in woods rather than the pedunculate or English oak, which tends to grow on lower ground and usually is a solitary tree growing around fields and so forth. They were obviously much used for shipbuilding, and then Henry VIII founds the Royal Naval Dockyard at Deptford, and the wood is the nearest source of timber to it. So clearly, it was valuable to the state. Henry actually passes an act which says for every acre of coppice wood, 12 trees have to be allowed to grow to their full height in order to make sure that there is enough timber for the navy. But obviously timber is also used for house building and all the rest of it, but the other great produce of the wood was charcoal. This could be oak or hornbeam. Hornbeam is especially useful because it has very high calorific content and gives off a great deal of heat, so it was very good for smelting iron, but also for firing bricks. And in fact there's actually documentary evidence that Archbishop Whitgift's hospital in Croydon, don't know how many of you know that building, which was built in the 1590s, at least some of the bricks were fired using wood from the North Wood. There's actually a receipt for wood from the kiln. So yeah, I mean, it built London in the sense that, well, certainly a lot of the houses were made of timber in those days, timber framed, but it also fired bricks and roof tiles. So yes, I mean, prior to the Industrial Revolution, it was a huge economic resource, and the reason it was subsequently whittled down to its present extent is that people no longer needed these, the produce of the woodlands.
But this
They can find you a book for your girlfriend, your husband, your girl or your boy. And if you've got a need for an uplifting read, Justine and Jonathan can pick out a book you'll enjoy. What a book at the Bookseller Crow on the hill. What a book at the Bookseller Crow on the hill. Crystal Palace Hill it is. But you can order online.